So I haven't been a ton of places. I've been to Slovakia, Germany, Canada, and various places in the United States. Um, oh, you just saw my messy floor. Wonderful. Um, None of those places have really given me much culture shock. I've in Germany we stayed with a family friend who lived in a rural area of Bavaria, and that was kind of different. Like they were making hay while we were there, so we helped, and that was something I'd never done. It was a little bit more. It felt like older technology. Like the computer technology wasn't great, but I can't say that's Germany. That's simply rural Germany for our family friends. Um, the more I've experienced more culture shock with more like microcultures. Um, for instance, one of the first communities I became a part of, because I was homeschooled and I didn't have a school community as a child, one of the first communities was the YouTube community. And it's very progressive and tolerant and accepting and non-offensive, right? But upon starting going to school and interacting more with in real life cultures, I realized that not everyone is um, so sensitive to things like that. Like a lot of people were way more misogynistic and like I almost said misogynistic and sexist, uh, and racist and just overall they held views or said things that I couldn't even imagine seeing in my previous culture. And that was probably the biggest culture shock I can think of, realizing that these people, who many of which are otherwise good people, are just in a culture where that's accepted and that is the norm. And that was probably the weirdest culture shock I've experienced. Not something where um, people have like different ways of living. Um, it's not quite the same type of culture I think Alex is talking about, but that is what really throws me off. Seeing people who just are expected to and live a different way. Like families, it always really messes with me when families just have completely different ways of functioning than I do. Like my family, we have a pretty strong emphasis on, respecting each other's space and property and stuff like that. Like, if I own something, I have to give you permission for you to use it. Like that's kind of a thing that we have in our family. Or and like violence isn't a big thing. Like me and my brother didn't really have any malicious fighting as children, and then I hear these stories, or I hear people talking about how much like they might have fought as kids, and that just seems kind of off. Or more strange is when people feel like they can just use my stuff, and it's kind of a little self-centered that this bugs me. But it really it really throws me off that some people just grew up where kind of in like a communist household. I don't like that I just called it communist, but basically where people use other people's things. That was just that's weird to me. That's just not how I think, and that's the kind of culture shock I am most familiar with. Um, just different ways of living, different ways of thinking that aren't geographic, that aren't based on where you live, but are more based on just how you were raised, based on how the person who raised you was raised, and yeah, that's what weirds me out. That's what kind of makes me uncomfortable and forces me to realize that my culture isn't the only culture. It's not so much stuff like going to another culture. And I think if I went to a place that's a little bit more different, less European, less Western, I would probably feel culture shock. Or if I stayed in a European nation for very long. I was only in Europe for like 2 weeks, which is barely long enough to like get a superficial concept of how people work. So, yeah. Plus, I only saw like a couple Germans, and there's a whole language barrier, and I could really only communicate to get things accomplished, not to understand the idiosyncrasies of the people I was staying with. But yeah, culture shock, man. And then here's the intro, which I've forgotten. Well, not forgotten. I haven't really had time. I'm a mess.